Rain dripped from the edges of her coat as Helen stood at the iron gate of the old mansion. She had walked from the bus stop, clutching a torn photograph that had almost lost its face to time. The boy in it was smiling. Her boy, the one she gave away 50 years ago. The mansion ahead looked too still, like it had forgotten how to breathe. Helen hesitated, then pushed the gate open. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes. At the porch, 2 sets of footprints trailed toward the door, one in, one out, both streaked with something dark. She knocked. Helen waited in the cold, her breath faint against the rain. The knock echoed down the porch, swallowed by the house. No response came. She pressed her palm to the door, feeling the chill through the wood. This was it, the moment she had feared for decades. Not the weather, not the distance, but the possibility of seeing the boy she abandoned look at her like a stranger. She whispered his name under her breath, just once, to see how it sounded after all these years. The sound was unfamiliar, too heavy for her mouth to carry. Her memory dragged her back to the day it all ended. A hospital hallway, a crying infant, a paper she wasn't ready to sign. She had been 19 and terrified. The social worker promised he'd be safe, promised a better life. Helen had told herself it was mercy. 50 years later, that mercy felt like betrayal. She folded the photograph and tucked it back into her pocket. The rain stung harder now, but she stayed. She had nothing left but this visit, this truth she could no longer keep buried beneath the silence of her own regret. The mansion loomed higher as she stepped closer, the paint untouched by time, the brass fixtures gleaming as though someone polished them daily. But there was something off about it. No sound of life, no voices, not even a dog. The hedges were perfect, trimmed like they were shaped by someone obsessed with control. She caught her reflection in a window, a frail woman with eyes that still carried unfinished business. She wondered if he lived alone, if he ever thought about the woman who left him, or if he'd built walls as tall as this house to keep her out. Helen's shoes left damp prints across the marble porch, smearing rain into the white stone. Her presence felt like a stain here, an intrusion into a life that had forgotten her. She lifted the brass knocker again and let it fall harder. The sound echoed like a judge's gavel. Somewhere behind the door, faint movement stirred, a shift, a creak, then silence again. Helen's heart did not race, it sank. She realized that every sound carried the weight of 50 years of questions, none of which she could take back once answered. Still, she stayed rooted to the spot. The door finally opened. A man in a dark vest and gloves stood there, the kind of servant who had learned not to smile unless told. He looked at her face, then at her soaked coat, then at the photograph peeking from her pocket. "Name?" he asked flatly. When she said it, her maiden name, his expression faltered, only for a second, but enough. He stepped aside and gestured toward the foyer, telling her to wait while he informed the family. His politeness was cold, like something practiced, but his eyes carried confusion he couldn't quite hide. The air inside smelled of polish and paper. The foyer stretched wide, the kind of wealth that looked sterile rather than grand. Helen stood awkwardly, dripping rainwater onto the marble floor. She didn't sit, though chairs lined the wall. The servant disappeared behind a pair of tall doors, leaving her alone with silence and portraits. Each painting was a face she didn't know, but the resemblance was there, the cheekbones, the brow, the faint shadow of something familiar. Her throat tightened. She had never seen her son grow. Every image of him she owned was of a baby. One portrait caught her attention. A man in a grey suit with eyes that could slice through the frame. Beneath it, a plaque read Elias Caro. The name tugged at something in her chest. She had heard it before, years ago, whispered through a neighbor's television as a man discussed real estate and power. Her son had become someone she could only have watched from a distance. She stepped closer to the painting, tracing the outline of his face with her gaze. The smile in the portrait wasn't warmth, it was victory. Helen wasn't sure she wanted to meet it. Helen took the photograph from her pocket again. The edges were soft and torn, the ink nearly gone, but the baby's expression was still there, a faint, crooked smile. She compared it to the man in the painting. The resemblance was undeniable. The same tilt of the chin, the same defiance behind the eyes. She wondered if he'd grown up believing his mother had died, or if he'd been told nothing at all. The thought that someone else raised him, called him son, pierced deeper than any regret she had ever known. She slipped the photo back into her coat. The ticking of a clock broke the quiet. Helen turned toward the sound, but it came from deeper inside the mansion. She listened closer. Footsteps, faint but deliberate, pacing. It felt like someone was deciding whether to meet her or let her leave unseen. She brushed the rain from her sleeve and straightened her coat. If he refused her, she'd still say what she came to say. She had rehearsed it 100 times on the bus. "I'm sorry, I had no choice." Now those words felt small. Forgiveness was something she no longer believed she deserved. The footsteps grew louder, steady, and calm, like they belonged to someone used to control. Helen's pulse thudded against her ribs. She fixed her eyes on the door, not sure what she'd do when it opened. The sound stopped abruptly. Then came the faint turn of a key, a lock sliding back. The tall doors creaked open, revealing only shadows and the shape of someone standing just out of sight. A voice she didn't recognize called her name, not miss, not ma'am, but her full first name. The familiarity in it froze her where she stood. The figure who stepped forward wasn't her son, but a younger man in a pressed black suit. He carried a tablet in one hand and regarded her with suspicion. "Mr. Caro is indisposed," he said. Helen's mouth opened, but no words came. He asked what business she had. She told him she needed only 5 minutes, nothing more. The man's eyes flicked to the wet photograph she still clutched, then back to her face. He nodded once and left without another word, closing the tall doors behind him, sealing her in with her thoughts. Helen waited. The clock's ticking grew louder, matching the faint hum of the house. Somewhere behind her, wind pressed through a vent, carrying the smell of rain and dust. The foyer lights dimmed slightly, or maybe it was her eyes adjusting. She noticed a large mirror near the staircase. Her reflection looked out of place among the polished wood and marble. She traced a hand across the edge of the glass and whispered, "You asked for this." The quiet swallowed her words before they reached her ears. She turned back toward the doors and waited for them to open again. A rustle drew her attention to a table by the stairs. A newspaper clipping lay under a glass weight. Caro Industries expands Wexler Holdings. Her eyes caught on the name, Wexler, her family name before everything fell apart. Her father's company had gone bankrupt when she was young, after he vanished under suspicion of fraud. Now here it was, alive again, attached to her son's empire. The irony cut deep. Her son had inherited not just her blood, but the same corrupted legacy she once ran from. Fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. She heard faint voices beyond the office doors, a man's tone clipped, authoritative. Her stomach tightened. Maybe he already knew who she was. Maybe he'd known for years. The servant reappeared, eyes downcast, and told her to follow him. The hallway was long and lined with art that looked too expensive to touch. Helen kept her head low, feeling smaller with every step. When they reached a final door at the end, the servant paused. "He'll see you now," he he said quietly, and left her standing there with nothing but the echo of her own breath. The door opened, and Helen stepped into a study lined with books and dark wood. Behind the desk stood the man she had searched for half a century to find, Elias Caro, her son. His eyes matched the baby's in the photograph exactly, though harder now, older, sharper. He didn't move toward her. He didn't smile. He simply waited. The space between them felt measured, like a test neither wanted to start. Helen's fingers brushed the photo in her pocket, unsure whether to show it or hide it forever. The choice felt heavier than anything she'd carried before. Elias gestured toward a chair across the desk, his expression unreadable. Helen sat, folding her wet hands in her lap. He asked what brought her here. His tone polite but detached, the kind used for business meetings. She looked at him, trying to find traces of the boy she once imagined. "I needed to see you," she said softly. He tilted his head, studying her like she was a riddle he hadn't decided to solve. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition. Then it vanished, replaced by the sharp chill of disinterest. Helen hesitated, then called him by the name she had given him at birth, a name she had whispered to herself every night for decades. The sound seemed to strike something deep in him. His shoulders stiffened, eyes narrowing. "Who told you that?" he asked. She answered truthfully, "No one." His hand tightened on the edge of the desk. The clock ticked behind them, too loud for comfort. For the first time, Elias's voice cracked slightly as he asked who she really was, but she couldn't bring herself to say the words yet. He stood and circled the desk, his movements deliberate. Helen could feel his suspicion growing heavier with each step. He stopped behind her, as if deciding whether to ask her to leave or demand an explanation. "You don't belong here," he said. Helen turned in her chair, her voice steady despite the tremor inside her. "I gave you that name," she whispered. "I'm the reason you have it." He didn't respond right away. When he did, it wasn't disbelief she heard. It was anger he couldn't contain. The idea that she might be telling the truth unsettled him. She told him she was his mother, the one who signed the papers half a century ago. He laughed once, hollow and without humor. "That's impossible," he said. Helen reached into her coat and took out the torn photograph. "You were 3 days old," she said. "You had a small scar on your shoulder from the incubator. I remember because I traced it with my finger before I said goodbye." Elias stared at her, silent. His composure cracked. Confusion crept into his expression, then faded into disbelief again, like he wanted to erase what he'd just felt. The tension filled the room, unspoken but suffocating. Elias took the photograph from her hand, examined it, then dropped it on the desk as if it carried disease. "You should go," he said quietly. Helen didn't move. "Please just listen," she pleaded. "I'm not asking for anything." He shook his head, already walking toward the window. His reflection in the glass looked haunted, though his voice stayed cold. "You shouldn't have come here. You've ruined enough already." She wanted to ask what he meant, but couldn't find her voice. The words settled like ash between them. He finally turned back to her, gesturing for her to follow him into another room. It was smaller, lined with books and dark panels. He shut the door and turned the lock. "Let's make sure this conversation stays private," he said, the edge in his tone unmistakable. Helen sat again, forcing herself to stay calm. She noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he poured himself a drink. The sound of ice clinking in the glass broke the stillness. "You said you don't want anything," he said. "People like you always do. So what is it this time?" Helen opened her mouth, but stopped when she noticed the papers scattered across his desk. A ledger lay open, columns of numbers scribbled in red ink. It wasn't ordinary accounting. Some pages were missing, others rewritten. One figure was circled repeatedly, and next to it, her family's old company name, Wexler. Her breath caught. "You're running the same business my father built," she said softly. Elias's jaw tightened. "He built nothing," he muttered. The calm in his voice didn't match the storm in his eyes. Helen realized he wasn't just protecting wealth. He was protecting something far more dangerous. The silence pressed against them as she pieced it together. "You're hiding something," she said. He didn't deny it. "Everyone hides something," he replied. "Even mothers." The jab hit hard. She looked down at the floor, ashamed, but when her eyes rose again, they landed on the ledger's final page. The signatures didn't match. The company books weren't just forged, they were stolen. He had inherited corruption and carried it forward. She wondered if he even knew how deep it went. Her father destroyed himself for money. Her son was repeating the same story without realizing how it would end. He set the glass down and leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Let's stop pretending," he said. "You didn't come here to confess. You came here because you want something. Everyone does." Helen shook her head. "I want to understand," she said. "I want to know if the man you became ever wondered about me." His mouth curved into a thin smile. "I never had to," he said. "Your name showed up in court records when I bought this house. That was enough." The words hit her harder than any slap. He had known she existed and chose to ignore it. He turned away, pacing the room. Helen's eyes drifted to a small framed photo on the desk, a woman she didn't recognize. "Your wife?" she asked quietly. Elias froze, then nodded once without turning. "She's gone," he said. The tone in his voice carried no sorrow, only exhaustion. Helen didn't press. She could feel the weight behind that single word, the kind that carried a story too dark to repeat. She clasped her hands together and whispered a prayer she hadn't said in years, though she wasn't sure if it was for him or for herself. When Elias spoke again, his voice sounded far away. "She disappeared 5 years ago," he said. "Police said she left me, but they never found her things. Not even her ring." He looked down at his hand, where a faint line marked the finger where one used to be. Helen said nothing. The confession had come out of nowhere, raw and half-formed. He didn't notice how her posture shifted, how her breath caught at the edge of his words. The guilt in his tone wasn't about loss. It was about something he couldn't say aloud. The corners of his mouth twisted into something cruel. "Do you know what's funny?" he asked. "She told me once that forgiveness was weakness. Maybe she was right." He laughed, not from humor but bitterness, mocking himself as much as her. Helen stayed silent, but the sting landed. The sound of his laughter filled the room like broken glass. "You came here for redemption," he said. "You won't find it here." Her heart sank, but she didn't look away. He didn't notice that behind him, the drink he had poured was staining the carpet, spreading like something rotten beneath the surface. Her eyes fell on a small object on the shelf behind him, a wedding ring, twisted and bent. The metal warped as though crushed in a fist. The faint smear of dried brown at its edge made her chest tighten. She realized then why he never mentioned his wife's name. Elias caught her staring. "Curiosity runs in the family, doesn't it?" he said quietly. Helen forced her gaze back to his face. "What happened to her?" He smiled faintly, the kind that said he wouldn't answer. "She left," he said again, but the lie was too thin to hold. Helen felt a shiver crawl through her chest, not from fear, but recognition. She had seen that same emptiness in her father before he fell apart. Men who built their lives on power always carried the same hollow in their eyes. She thought of leaving, of ending this before it turned darker, but something held her there. "You don't have to live this way," she said. Elias turned to face her fully. "And what way is that?" She opened her mouth, but didn't answer. Every truth she wanted to say felt too small against the storm she saw in him. The phone on his desk buzzed, screen flashing with a notification. Elias glanced at it, then froze. Helen leaned forward slightly and caught a glimpse of the message. Her name was on the screen. Someone had texted him. "She's in the house." Her throat tightened. She hadn't told anyone where she was going. Elias's eyes met hers, filled with something darker than anger, fear. "Who else knows you're here?" he demanded. Helen stammered that no one did, but his face said he didn't believe her. He picked up the phone, scrolling fast, his jaw clenching tighter with every second. The assistant's shadow appeared outside the office door, pacing nervously. Helen could see him through the glass panel, speaking into a phone, glancing toward the room as if expecting something terrible. Elias lowered the blinds without a word. "They always listen," he muttered. Helen asked who they were, but he didn't answer. The weight of paranoia filled the air. He poured another drink, his hand less steady now. For the first time, she saw fear behind the arrogance. It wasn't fear of her. It was fear of whoever had sent that message and what they might be about to do. Elias leaned against the desk, staring into the amber liquid as if it might hold answers. "You think I built this?" he said. "I didn't. I inherited it, same as you inherited shame." Helen didn't respond, only watched the tremor in his hand. The mask of control he had worn since the moment she arrived was cracking. "They think I have something," he said. "They're wrong." She asked who he meant. He smirked faintly, shaking his head. "You're better off not knowing." The light from the desk lamp flickered, catching the tired lines beneath his eyes. He looked decades older. He set the glass down and rubbed his temples. "I knew you were alive," he said suddenly. "I hired people years ago to find you." Helen's chest tightened. "Then why didn't you?" she asked. He looked up, eyes red-rimmed. "Because you would have ruined everything." He let out a hollow laugh. "Your name was on the adoption file. If anyone found out, I'd lose the company, the house, everything. They'd call it fraud." The words sank into her like stones. He had chosen power over truth, just as her father once did. The curse had passed cleanly through the bloodline. Helen stood, shaking her head. "You can't live like this," she said. Elias smiled bitterly. "I already do." He moved toward a drawer and pulled out a small box. Inside, a key rested beside an envelope marked "Do Not Open." He looked at it for a long moment, then closed it again. "You shouldn't have come here," he said quietly. "You've just made it worse." Helen stepped back, realizing he wasn't angry. He was terrified. The secrets in this house had grown roots too deep to pull free. Whatever he was protecting, it was more dangerous than guilt. Helen sat again, exhausted, and let the quiet settle. She unfolded the photograph one more time, smoothing its creases against her knee. The baby's face had faded almost completely now, only the outline remaining. She whispered to it softly, not caring if Elias heard. "I'm sorry I wasn't there." Elias turned away, pretending not to listen. The clock ticked. The air felt heavy with all the things neither of them could fix. In that brief silence, Helen understood that forgiveness might not come, but she needed to ask anyway. She just didn't know if she still had time. Elias spoke again, his voice low. "Did anyone see you come here?" Helen lied and said no. "Good," he replied, almost relieved. "I don't want attention." He walked to the door and tested the lock, then checked the windows, his movements anxious. "Someone's been watching me," he said. "I get messages, threats. They know everything." Helen's stomach twisted. "The people who texted you." He nodded, but didn't elaborate. She could tell he wasn't just paranoid, he was trapped. "Then call the police," she said. He laughed under his breath. "You think they don't already know?" He closed the blinds completely, shutting out the faint light from the courtyard. "You brought trouble here," he muttered. Helen rose from the chair, indignant. "I only brought myself." He stared at her for a long time, face unreadable. "That's enough," he said. "You shouldn't have my name. You shouldn't have come at all." She realized then that he wasn't protecting himself from her. He was protecting himself from someone else who wanted her gone. Her presence had broken some fragile balance he'd been maintaining. Whatever this was, it had started long before she knocked on that door. Helen's eyes caught the ledger again, still open on the desk. She walked closer. "These numbers," she said, "they're not real, are they?" Elias sighed. "They don't have to be. They just have to match what the board expects." His calmness terrified her more than anger would have. "You're stealing from your own company," she said. "No," he answered. "I'm buying time." She didn't understand. For what? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned his back and muttered, "They have something on me, on her too." Helen froze, realizing her meant his missing wife. He opened a drawer and took out a cheap plastic box, the kind cereal toys used to come in. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a burner phone. He powered it on and handed it to Helen. The screen showed dozens of messages, all from the same unknown number. Each one carried threats, photos of him in his home, and references to his wife. The last message read, "She's still waiting." Helen's throat tightened. "They're blackmailing you," she said. Elias nodded. "And I've been paying them to keep quiet." His eyes looked hollow, like someone who hadn't slept in years. Helen tried to reason with him. "You can stop this. Tell the truth." Elias smirked faintly. Truth never helped anyone in this family. He leaned back, his voice softer now. "Do you know what honesty did to your father? To you, it ruins people." Helen wanted to argue, but couldn't. He was right, and they both knew it. The room felt colder as the rain outside grew heavier. Elias turned off the phone and slid it back into the box. "You came here for peace," he said quietly. "There isn't any left to find." Elias walked toward the window, keeping his back to her. "They think I can fix it," he said. "They think I still have what they want." Helen stood, unsure whether to approach or keep her distance. "Then why not tell them the truth?" she asked. He turned, eyes hollow. "Because the truth is worse." He grabbed a folder from a nearby shelf and tossed it on the desk. Inside were photographs of a woman, his wife, standing beside a man Helen didn't recognize. "She betrayed me," he whispered, "and they made sure I'd pay for it." Before Helen could speak, footsteps echoed down the hall. The assistant appeared at the door, panic clear on his face. "Sir, the police are here," he said. "They're asking questions about Mrs. Caro." Elias's expression didn't change, but the air shifted. "Tell them they're wasting their time," he said sharply. The assistant hesitated, eyes flicking to Helen. "They said someone called them," he added. Elias's gaze snapped toward her. "Was it you?" Helen shook her head quickly, but suspicion had already taken root. Elias's control was crumbling, and everyone in the house could feel it. The assistant retreated down the hallway, leaving the door ajar. Helen could hear faint radio chatter from outside, police cars parked at the gate. Elias locked the door again, this time harder, like he expected someone to break through. "You brought them here," he said. Helen's voice trembled. "I didn't." "Then how do they know?" he snapped. She stepped back, hands raised. "You think I'd come here, after 50 years just to destroy you?" His eyes glinted with something close to despair. "You already did," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It didn't sound like blame, it sounded like surrender. Helen glanced toward the ledger, still lying open, on the desk. "If you're innocent, show them," she said. "Let the police see the truth." He shook his head. There's no innocence here, Mother. Only leverage. The word mother hit her like a knife, spoken not with affection, but bitterness. They'll take everything, he muttered. The company, the estate, my name. Helen stepped closer, reaching for his arm, but he pulled away. Maybe they should, she said quietly. He stared at her, stunned by her calm. For the first time, he looked less like a man of power and more like a frightened son. Helen moved toward the fireplace, needing distance from the tension pressing in on them. A faint crack in the mantel caught her eye. She reached out and found a hidden panel slightly loose. Inside, a thin metal box rested. She opened it and found letters, old and yellowed, written by someone named Rose. The handwriting was gentle, affectionate. They were addressed to Elias, but every letter ended before the signature torn away. Helen turned back to him, realizing this wasn't his wife's name. It was his adoptive mother's. Whatever he had done, it started long before the marriage fell apart. The sirens outside grew louder, bouncing off the mansion's walls. Elias stood frozen, staring at the floor. "You don't understand," he said. "They're not here for her. They're here for me." Helen's voice broke through, then stopped running. He raised his head, eyes wide and wild. "It's too late." He opened another drawer, pulling out a revolver. Helen gasped, but he didn't raise it. "One bullet missing," he said softly. "I found it gone this morning." His hand shook as he turned the cylinder. "Someone's been inside the house. They want me to think it's her." Helen's gaze darted to the door, hoping for a knock, a voice, anything human. "You need help," she said. "You can still fix this." He gave a dry laugh. "You don't fix a curse, Mother. You pass it on." He looked at her like she was the ghost he'd been avoiding all his life. "Do you know what your father used to say?" he asked. "He said some bloodlines are born stained." Helen flinched. "That's not true," she whispered. "We can change." Elias shook his head. "We don't change. We just find new ways to hide." He walked toward the desk and grabbed the ledger. "They think I hid the money," he said. "They're wrong. I gave it to someone else." "To buy silence?" Helen asked. "Who?" He hesitated, then whispered. "The man she left with." Her knees nearly gave out. "You paid the man your wife ran away with." He looked at her, eyes glassy. "He never left. He's in the garden, buried under the statue she loved." The words came out so calmly that they barely registered at first. Helen's hand covered her mouth as she realized the confession wasn't about theft anymore. A sharp knock rattled the door, followed by the assistant's voice. "Sir, please." "They're coming in through the back." Elias grabbed the revolver and pointed it toward the door, trembling. "They'll destroy everything," he shouted. Helen moved toward him, her voice calm but firm. "Put it down, Elias." He turned the gun slightly toward her, not in threat, but desperation. "You don't understand what they'll do to me." She stepped closer, speaking softly. "I understand what you've already done to yourself." For a moment he froze, hand shaking, eyes searching hers for any trace of mercy. Helen reached out slowly, her hand resting on the edge of the desk. The photograph she had brought lay face down beside the spilled drink. She flipped it over. "You were smiling," she said softly. "That's who you were before all of this." Elias's breathing slowed. The gun lowered slightly. For the first time, he looked tired instead of angry. "You should have left me in the past," he said quietly. She shook her head. "You were never the past." The room stilled as both of them stood on the edge of something irreversible. The crash of breaking glass snapped them out of it. Police voices shouted from the back hall, boots pounding against marble. Elias turned, eyes wide. "They'll kill me before I explain," he said. "No one cares about explanations." Helen backed away as he moved toward the side door, clutching the gun. "You can still tell the truth," she said. Not to them, he muttered. To me. He hesitated at the doorway, caught between running and surrendering. You wouldn't forgive me, he said. Try me, she replied, but the words came too late. He was already gone into the shadows. The police stormed into the room, weapons drawn. Helen raised her hands as they shouted commands. One officer grabbed her arm, pulling her aside. Where's Elias Caro? He demanded. She shook her head, too stunned to speak. The room spun, papers scattered, the ledger on the floor, the spilled drink soaking into the carpet. The officers spread out, calling for backup. One of them stepped on the photo, smearing it further into ruin. Helen whispered, "Don't hurt him." The officer didn't respond. The house had become a maze of doors and secrets, and Elias had vanished into it completely. Outside, the rain hit the roof like static. Helen stood by the window, watching blue lights flicker against the trees. Through the storm, she thought she saw movement, a shadow near the garden statue. Then a figure stumbled from behind it, coat drenched, face hidden. He looked up toward the window, meeting her eyes across the distance. There was no anger now, only sorrow. He raised one hand in what could have been farewell or surrender. Then he turned and disappeared into the dark. Helen pressed her hand against the glass, whispering his name to the storm. A single gunshot split the air. The echo rolled through the house, followed by shouts. Helen's heart dropped. She ran toward the back door, but officers blocked her path. "Stay here," one ordered. She tried to see past them, catching only flashes of wet ground and uniforms moving. The assistant's body lay on the steps, a crimson bloom spreading beneath him. Helen's knees weakened. "Where's Elias?" she cried, but no one answered. The officer nearest her simply lowered his head. "He's gone," he said. "We don't know where." The word "gone" carried too many meanings to bear. The chaos swirled around her, but Helen felt detached, as if her body no longer belonged to her. An officer guided her to a chair, asking questions she couldn't process. She stared at the empty doorway, expecting Elias to appear again, furious or broken, or both. Instead, all she saw was the rain pooling at the threshold, washing away footprints that would soon mean nothing. A detective approached, asking her relation to Elias Caro. Helen opened her mouth, then stopped. "No one," she said finally. "I'm no one." The lie burned, but the truth hurt worse. They took her to the station for questioning. Hours passed. The clock on the wall ticked with mechanical indifference. When they finally released her, dawn had begun to break, painting the sky in a pale gray. As she stepped outside, she spotted an officer carrying the ledger in an evidence bag. The red ink bled faintly through the plastic. Helen felt the weight of it all. The inheritance of sin passed from father to son, and now from son to silence. She had wanted forgiveness, but found something colder, the truth, stripped bare and merciless. In the back seat of the police car, taking her home, Helen noticed the officer, holding a file marked Caro Investigation. Inside, a photo peeked through Elias, with a man she didn't recognize. The caption read Victor Wexler. Her blood ran cold. Her father's name. The truth reshaped itself in her mind. Her father hadn't vanished all those years ago. He had changed his name and raised her son as his heir. The betrayal she'd spent decades blaming herself for was engineered from the start. Every thread led back to the same man she thought had died in disgrace. At home, Helen sat at her kitchen table, the world still spinning. The police had left her alone, assuming she was just another bystander in a scandal. She unfolded the photograph again. The paper was falling apart, the baby's face nearly gone. But now she saw it differently. Her father's cruelty, her son's corruption, they were echoes of the same lie. She had spent 50 years chasing forgiveness from the wrong person. Outside, the rain had stopped. leaving only the distant hum of tires on wet asphalt. The silence inside her house felt heavier than any accusation. Her phone buzzed on the counter, startling her. No one called her at that hour. She picked it up, expecting another detective. Instead, the number was unknown. One message flashed on the screen. "He's still alive." No name, no explanation. Helen froze. Another message followed. "He needs you to stay quiet." She stared at the words until the screen dimmed. She didn't know if the sender meant Elias or her father. Maybe both. The phone slipped from her hand onto the table. For the first time, she realized her story wasn't over. It had just changed shape. Helen deleted the messages and turned off the phone. Some truths, she decided, didn't need another audience. The police could chase their evidence. She would keep her silence. The cost of honesty had already claimed too many lives. As she sat there, dawn light spilled through the window, pale and unforgiving. She whispered to herself, "Let it end here." But deep down, she knew it wouldn't. The past didn't die when buried. It waited for someone brave or foolish enough to dig it up again. She just hoped it wouldn't be him. Days later, Helen was released from all questioning. No one proved her involvement in anything. She returned to her small apartment, where the walls felt closer now. Reporters gathered outside for days, then disappeared when new scandals replaced her story. She avoided the news, afraid to hear his name again. On her table sat the torn photograph, edges curling. She considered throwing it away, but couldn't. Every time she looked at it, she remembered both the child she'd lost and the man he became. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't owed, it was impossible. That Sunday, Helen walked to the old church at the end of her street. The doors were open, candles flickering near the altar. She knelt quietly and placed the photograph on the steps. "For him," she whispered, "and for me." Her voice shook, but she didn't cry. She had run out of tears long ago. The priest passed behind her, offering a kind nod without asking questions. She left before the service began, stepping into the cold morning air. The world outside looked cleaner than it had in years, though she knew it hadn't really changed. Across the street, a black car idled with tinted windows. Helen paused, sensing eyes on her. The passenger window lowered just enough for her to see him. Elias, alive. He looked thinner, older, but alive. He didn't signal for her to come closer. They simply watched each other. Two lives tied together by choices neither could undo. Then he raised a hand, not to wave, but in acknowledgement, a truce without words. The car rolled away, a moment later, disappearing into traffic. Helen stood still until it was gone, her breath clouding the air like a prayer she'd never finish. Helen walked home slowly, the weight in her chest both lighter and heavier at once. She unlocked her door, took off her coat, and sat by the window. The streets were quiet. A letter had been slipped under her door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with her father's handwriting. "Blood doesn't wash clean," it read. "It only changes hands." There was no signature, just a smudge of ink where his name should have been. Helen folded the paper and set it beside the photograph, letting them sit together like two ghosts that refused to leave. Night came, and Helen watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. She didn't know if her son would ever come back, or if he even wanted to. But for the first time, she didn't feel the need to chase him. Some stories didn't end with redemption. They ended with recognition. She looked at the photograph one last time, now little more than paper and stains, and whispered, "I forgive you anyway." Outside, rain began again, soft against the glass. The mansion, the secrets, the blood, all still out there, but Helen finally stopped waiting for the door to open.